At 5:42 in the morning, before the sun had even risen over the quiet fields of Burkina Faso's Yatena province, the sky tore open. Two precision-guided missiles struck a rural outpost, reducing a vital communications tower to twisted metal. In seconds, flames engulfed the structure. 3 lives were lost that morning: 2 soldiers who had been on routine watch, and a civilian technician who had been working to keep the lines of communication alive. 7 more were injured. The silence of dawn gave way to the sound of fire and shock. This was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Within hours, the Ministry of Defense confirmed what many already feared. The strike had not come from within Burkina Faso. It had originated from a United States military base in neighboring Niger, more than 600 kilometers away. There had been no joint briefing, no shared intelligence, and no warning. For many, the question was not only why this outpost had been attacked, but what the attack truly meant. President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation later that day. His voice was calm, but his words carried steel. He told the people that this was not simply an assault on a small rural station. It was a challenge to the dignity of a sovereign nation. He urged the country to remain steady, not to see the attack as a reason to panic, but as a reminder that sovereignty means nothing if it can be ignored. Across Burkina Faso, people listened. Some were afraid, but many felt something deeper, a sense of unity and defiance. If a small outpost could be struck without warning, then what else was at risk? If one African voice could be silenced, what did that say about the future of all? If a single act before sunrise can shake an entire nation, what does it reveal about the world we live in today? That is the question we will explore. The missiles landed at 5:42 in the morning, but the shock traveled much faster than the fire. Within minutes, the news reached nearby villages. Families rushed into the streets, searching the horizon, wondering whether the sky itself had turned hostile. By the time emergency responders arrived, the tower that had once connected the northern border to Central Command was gone. All that remained was scorched earth and twisted steel. The cost was not only 3 lives and 7 injuries. It was the silence left behind when the voices of a community were cut off. The Ministry of Defense confirmed the worst fears. The strike had originated from a United States base in Niger, more than 600 kilometers away. There had been no coordination with Burkinabe authorities, no intelligence shared, no warning given. For a nation that had fought hard to reclaim its sovereignty, this was not just another attack. It was a deliberate violation of independence. Officials declared the act a breach of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which protects the territorial integrity of all member states. Inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, alarms sounded, but the response was measured. The government placed all military forces on high alert. Border posts along Mali and Niger were reinforced with an additional 1,200 troops. Defensive positions in the capital shifted to DEFCON 2 readiness. Soldiers patrolled key points around schools, markets, and fuel depots. But the response was not designed to invite war. It was designed to steady the nation. That same evening, President Ibrahim Traoré appeared live on national television. His words were calm but firm. He told his people that the strike was not simply an attack on a facility, but on the very idea that African states could control their own destinies. His choice of tone was deliberate. He did not shout. He did not promise revenge. Instead, he stood as a leader who wanted to show his citizens that panic would not define them. What followed was unlike anything Burkina Faso had seen in recent years. In the capital, Revolution Square filled with more than 30,000 people. They did not riot. They stood together. Some carried handmade signs. Others sang songs of resistance. Families held candles for the 3 victims who had died that morning. The message was not rage. It was unity. Beyond the capital, the reaction spread. In Bamako, more than 50,000 people marched through Independence Avenue. In Conakry, a candlelight vigil honored the dead. In Nairobi, small but determined groups gathered outside the United States Embassy, demanding answers. Radio shows in Dakar and Addis Ababa were flooded with calls from citizens asking questions that reached far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Was this strike a punishment for leaving Western military agreements? Was it meant as a warning to other African nations considering the same path? Civil society groups mobilized quickly. Journalists demanded transparency. Who were the alleged terrorists that Washington claimed to have targeted? Why had no photos, names, or evidence been shared? When no answers came, the silence itself became part of the story. Within 24 hours, African media outlets were running headlines under one phrase: the strike that woke the continent. Social media amplified the message. Hashtags that began in Ouagadougou merged with Pan-African calls for unity. The words, "our land, our right," trended from Lomé to Luanda. In the northern provinces closest to the strike zone, schools were closed for 2 days. Trauma support teams visited clinics to help families cope with fear and loss. Local officials organized town halls, showing photos of the damage, satellite maps, and answering questions from citizens. Instead of hiding information, the government chose to be transparent. For a country that had endured political turbulence in the past, this approach was new. It helped calm rumors and strengthened trust. People were afraid, yes, but they were not confused. International observers watched closely. To the outside world, the missiles were an act of force. To the people of Burkina Faso, they became something else entirely. They were a line drawn in the sand. For decades, Africans had been told that sovereignty was conditional, that power was negotiated elsewhere. But now, standing in the ashes of a small outpost, citizens asked themselves aloud, if our voice can be ignored so easily, then what meaning does sovereignty have at all? And so the question began to echo, not only in parliament halls, but in homes, markets, and even in songs sung at night. This was no longer just the story of one rural province. It was the beginning of a larger reckoning. But was this truly only Burkina Faso's crisis, or had it already become Africa's awakening? The days that followed the missile strike revealed something deeper than anger. In Ouagadougou, Revolution Square filled with more than 30,000 citizens. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not in chaos, but in defiance. Families carried candles, children held handwritten signs, and elderly men leaned on canes as they joined the crowd. The square became a sea of voices rising together, not to demand war, but to declare unity. The message was clear. Sovereignty was not a slogan, it was a right. Across Burkina Faso, similar gatherings emerged. In Bobo Dioulasso, villagers cleared space in front of a community hall where thousands prayed and sang together. In Kaya, market women who had lost relatives in past conflicts marched with bowls of grain balanced on their heads, a symbol of survival and resistance. The gatherings were peaceful, but powerful. What might have been a moment of despair became a display of resilience. Beyond Burkina Faso, the reaction rippled outward. In Bamako, more than 50,000 people marched down Independence Avenue, waving both Malian and Burkinabe flags. In Conakry, a candlelight vigil honored the 3 victims. In Nairobi, demonstrators walked to the gates of the United States Embassy, holding placards that read, "Respect African Sovereignty." In Accra, students organized teach-ins, debating whether Africa's security should be tied to foreign bases at all. For the first time in years, the language of sovereignty was not confined to speeches in parliaments. It was spoken in the streets, in homes, and in classrooms. President Ibrahim Traoré became the focal point of this moment. When he addressed the African Union through a secure video link, his image filled a hall in Addis Ababa. His tone was calm, his words deliberate, but the steel in his voice was unmistakable. If the sovereignty of one African state can be violated without consequence, he declared, then none of us are truly sovereign. The line echoed across the continent. Within hours, governments from Nigeria, Guinea, and Senegal condemned the strike. Ghana, typically cautious in its alignment, urged Washington to provide an explanation. Even smaller nations that rarely challenged great powers spoke with unusual clarity. The continent was no longer silent. Civil society groups added their voices. Journalists demanded evidence of the alleged extremist threat that had justified the strike. Lawyers with the African Bar Association issued a formal opinion, labeling the attack a violation of international law. Artists responded as well. In Ouagadougou, a mural appeared overnight depicting 3 figures standing beneath the words, "Our land, our right." In Bamako, a poet read verses comparing the silence of the victims to the silence of centuries when Africa's voice was ignored. Inside Burkina Faso, the government's decision to share information transparently became a turning point. Town hall meetings in Ouagadougou and Ouagadougou showed citizens satellite images and damage reports. Instead of leaving room for rumors, officials opened the floor for questions. Parents worried about safety, traders asked about fuel supplies, and young people demanded to know how their country would prevent such attacks in the future. The answers were not always complete, but the act of listening mattered. People felt included, not dismissed. The impact on politics was immediate. Opposition leaders who had criticized Traoré for his security strategy found themselves sidelined. Public opinion coalesced around the president, not because he promised quick revenge, but because he steadied the nation at its most fragile moment. A survey just 5 days after the strike showed his approval rating rising from 62% to 81%. Among young people, support was even higher, nearly 90%. This moment of unity was not limited to politics. In churches, sermons shifted from theology to sovereignty. In mosques, imams spoke about the right of a people to protect their land and their dignity. At universities, students drafted resolutions calling for a re-evaluation of all foreign military agreements. For many, the missile strike became more than an act of violence. It became a symbol, a dividing line between a past shaped by dependency and a future claimed through resilience. Yet outside Africa, the conversation took a different tone. In Washington, the strike was described as a counterterrorist operation. In European capitals, officials called for calm. But in the streets of Africa, the language was sharper, more personal, and filled with memory. People were no longer asking only about Burkina Faso. They were asking whether Africa itself would ever be heard, without first asking permission. The emotional climate reached its peak when diaspora communities in Paris, London, and New York rallied in public squares. Their numbers were small, but their voices were clear. They felt betrayed by the silence of the governments they now lived under. One student in Paris told a reporter, "If our voices are ignored both at home and abroad, then where do we truly belong?" And so the missile strike, meant to cripple a single outpost, had instead awakened a continent. But the question remained, would this awakening lead to lasting change, or would it be drowned out by the weight of global power? In the days after the missile struck, the people of Burkina Faso faced the choice between fear and focus. They chose focus. Life in the capital changed quickly. Checkpoints multiplied. Soldiers stood guard outside schools, markets, and government buildings. The tone of Ouagadougou shifted. It was not panic. It was alertness. Radios no longer opened their morning programs with music. They began with defense updates and news of community gatherings. In the northern provinces near Yatena, schools were temporarily closed. Parents kept their children indoors, while local markets reopened under the watch of armed patrols. The Ministry of Information organized town halls, where residents were shown maps of the strike zone, photos of the damage, and even satellite data. People were asked for their questions and given the chance to speak. This transparency surprised many. In a country that had lived through cycles of instability, leaders were now choosing to inform rather than to control. The effect was striking. Rumors did not take hold, and people were scared, but not confused. Politically, the consequences were immediate. The National Assembly convened within days and passed what became known as the Sovereignty Bill. The law restricted foreign surveillance and military activity without explicit local authorization. It also increased funding for domestic intelligence and training programs for young analysts and engineers. For years, Burkina Faso had depended on outside intelligence sharing. Now the country was moving to professionalize its own capacity. This shift signaled to citizens that the nation was not only reacting, but also restructuring its future. Public opinion shifted as well. Ibrahim Traoré, once criticized as a transitional figure, now carried the weight of a statesman. A national poll conducted by the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion revealed that his approval rating had jumped from 62% before the strike to 81% just 5 days after. Among citizens under 35, nearly 90% expressed confidence in his leadership. The opposition, once vocal, struggled to remain relevant. Their criticism seemed hollow in the face of a government that had steadied the people instead of silencing them. Civil society began to take on new life. Students on university campuses formed discussion groups and hosted panels to debate the meaning of sovereignty. Sermons in churches and mosques blended faith with calls for discipline and national unity. Writers, musicians, and artists responded in their own mediums. In downtown Ouagadougou, a theater troupe staged a play titled "Permission Denied," telling the story of the strike through the eyes of a market woman. On the radio, a poet compared Traoré to a lion surrounded by jackals. In schools, teachers explained the events to children using illustrated maps and stories, not to instill fear, but to nurture understanding. The economic front also felt the weight of the crisis. Fuel prices jumped 12% in a single day as people rushed to stock up. The Ministry of Trade quickly introduced stabilization measures, capping fuel prices and prioritizing grain imports from neighboring Ghana and Togo. Inflation stayed under control, and panic buying subsided. By ensuring that food and fuel remained available, the government cut off one of the main triggers of unrest. When basic needs were secured, the public energy shifted away from frustration and toward purpose. As a result, a sense of collective responsibility began to spread. Communities organized neighborhood patrols and cleanup groups. Village podcasts and local radio shows held open discussions about how to strengthen the country's independence. Parents told their children that the strike was not just a wound, but a lesson. A generation that had grown up seeing its leaders waver now saw a government that had chosen restraint, clarity, and unity. The political effect reached beyond the capital. Regional governors and local councils passed resolutions supporting the sovereignty bill. Ministers reviewed existing security agreements with foreign powers. Some contracts were suspended, others rewritten to require joint consent for every operation. These moves sent a strong message abroad, but inside the country, they sent something more powerful. They told the people that their government was finally drawing a line and standing by it. The strike that was meant to weaken Burkina Faso had done something unexpected. It gave the nation a sense of cohesion that had been missing for years. Citizens who had once doubted their government now began to see it as a partner rather than a distant authority. For the first time in a long time, people spoke about their country with a sense of ownership. But unity always brings new challenges. As Burkina Faso strengthened its voice at home, questions lingered about how the world would respond. Could a small nation hold firm against the pressure of global powers that had long shaped the region's destiny? Or would the weight of old alliances eventually fracture the unity that had just been born? While Burkina Faso found unity in tragedy, the rest of the world was unsettled. In Washington, officials described the strike as a counterterrorist operation. The Pentagon insisted that a high-level extremist threat had been neutralized. Yet when reporters pressed for details, no names, no photos, and no post-strike assessments were provided. In closed-door briefings, senators raised concerns that such unilateral action in a sovereign state set a dangerous precedent. Some warned that it undermined not only America's moral standing, but also the fragile partnerships it claimed to protect. At the State Department, diplomats scrambled to control the narrative. They spoke of commitment to African security and prosperity, but frustration leaked into private conversations. Even allies admitted that the lack of coordination with Burkina Faso and the African Union had fueled distrust. Across Latin America and Asia, officials voiced unease. If Washington could strike without consent in Africa, what might stop similar actions elsewhere? Europe's reaction was cautious and divided. France, still reeling from its own setbacks in the Sahel, issued a careful statement urging calm and dialogue. Germany and Italy expressed concern over the erosion of trust in international cooperation. The United Kingdom remained largely silent. Russia and China, however, wasted no time. Moscow called the strike neo-colonial aggression. Beijing framed it as proof that Africa needed stronger South-to-South cooperation. Both countries seized the moment to present themselves as partners who respected sovereignty. At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's ambassador demanded an Emergency Security Council session. The debate was heated. Russia and China condemned the strike outright. Western representatives defended the need for security, but struggled to justify the absence of consultation. African delegates spoke with unusual unity, insisting that the violation of one member state was a violation of all. The world was now confronted with a difficult truth. A small African nation had refused to flinch, and in doing so, it had forced powerful nations to explain themselves. The missiles had landed on a remote outpost, but the tremors were felt in every diplomatic chamber. Could this incident mark not only a turning point for Burkina Faso, but also the beginning of a broader challenge to the way global power has long been exercised? By the end of the week, it was clear that the missiles had done more than destroy a communications tower. They had redrawn the conversation about power and sovereignty across Africa. In Ouagadougou, people no longer asked if the government could survive. They asked whether Africa itself was ready to speak with one voice. For the first time in years, the talk in homes and markets was not about leaving, but about standing firm. Yet unity does not erase danger. The Sahel remains one of the most fragile regions on Earth. Armed groups still move across porous borders. Economic shocks can arrive overnight, and international pressure has not disappeared. Some foreign diplomats whisper of new conditions on aid. Others quietly extend visa delays, hoping to slow the momentum of a continent that has begun to look inward instead of outward. The risk is real. A single misstep could turn solidarity into isolation. The deeper question, however, reaches beyond Burkina Faso. Was this strike an attempt to discipline one small nation for walking its own path? Was it meant as a warning to others considering the same? Or was it simply a symptom of a global order that struggles to hear voices outside its own centers of power? These questions will not be answered quickly, but they will shape the choices of a generation. For Burkina Faso, the days ahead will test whether the unity of the moment can become the foundation of a lasting future. For Africa, the challenge is larger still. Can sovereignty be protected not only in law, but in daily life? Can dignity endure when pressure mounts? And for the world, there is a moral reckoning. If sovereignty can be ignored in one place, then what does it mean anywhere? If this story has stirred something in you, let it guide your reflection. Share your thoughts so that your voice becomes part of this larger conversation. The awakening of Africa is not only its story, it is a reminder that justice, dignity, and courage belong to all who choose to stand. We will meet again in the next story, where the search for truth continues. May God bless Africa, the land of resilience and unbroken will.